and the type of stories that was being told and how those resonated in us, the audience. And so that's why they can't duplicate it. And Gene Roddenberry was the visionary. You know, you see that in my books. You see his memos. You see him leading the charge. You see him giving direction to everybody on keeping it on track. And so when he became ill during the early days of Next Generation and wasn't able to do it anymore and had to hand it off to other people, the franchise started changing. Each show had less Star Trek in it. They had the uniforms, they had the name, they had all that stuff, but it didn't really come off as authentic. And I don't know if we'll ever see that again. So what the corporations do is they'll turn to somebody like J.J. Abrams or Quentin Tarantino, and they'll say, well, you're a big hit, so here, we're giving this to you. Go do what you want, because your last movie made this much money, so we're going to trust you, instead of looking for somebody to do Star Trek the right way.
Could you imagine, this my imagination, but the two movies, you know, Star Trek that was made recently, if Vic would have been the captain? I mean, seriously. Yeah. At least, you know...
yes, I'm with you. I don't think Christopher Pine gets that character at all. I don't think the guy playing Spock gets him, and I know that's a kind of a risque thing to say because he's very popular and people seem to like him. But, you know, I was just reading this memo from Roddenberry today for the book I'm doing now, the second volume of this two-book set on the 1970s. And he's writing to Harlan Ellison, a 5-page memo. And he's telling him, because they're trying to come up with a movie script and everything else, and he's saying, you know, the problem is with these scripts that keep coming in is they're comic book. You know, Star Trek was real. The violence, if we did violence on Star Trek, we did it for a reason. We did it to show people not to do violence. And he said violence is a very important factor in movies. We shouldn't get rid of it, but we should use it properly. And the thing that bugged Roddenberry so much, because he was an ex-Army pilot, he was an ex-cop, and he wrote right in this memo, he said, the things that really bother me is when I see movies and TV shows where two guys get into a fist fight and they're bashing each other on and on and on, and then afterwards they spit a little blood out and they put their one arm around the other guy and says, buddy, I respect you. You're tough. Let me buy you a drink. And he said, you know, when a big guy hits another big guy in the face, you've got fractured knuckles, you've got broken cheekbones, you've got teeth falling out. It's ugly. And movies and TV don't portray it in a real way. And he said, whenever we did violence on Star Trek, we portrayed it in a real way. We showed the consequences. And the reason I mention this is because I remember going and seeing one of these new movies. And I think there's 3 of them now. But I think it was the second or the third one, whichever one it was. And Spock gets into a fight with Khan, and they reimagined it all. They changed it all. But he gets into a fight, and this fight goes on for 5 minutes. And these guys will hit each other, and the guy will go flying through the air and slam up against a wall and get up and get back into the fight. And I'm sitting there. I don't care if Khan is a genetically involved superhuman. I don't care if Spock is a Vulcan. There's still flesh and blood. And if a body slams against a wall like that, you're going to have broken bones, a crushed body. And so I'm watching this thing, and I'm thinking it's comic book. And Star Trek was never comic book. These movies are. So, no, I give them a thumbs down. They're entertaining, but they're crap.
Well, I hate to say it, the captain never got into the part of being the captain. It was like, you know, he was, I don't know, it was just nothing there, no feeling to it. And he did
bland. He's bland. He's cool. He's sexy. He's hip. He's bland. Kirk was a flawed character. Kirk was a guy you would follow him up the mountain if he's leading the charge. But then he would go into his quarters afterwards and ache over the fact that he lost 1 man or 2 men or 3 men, and McCoy would have to come in and talk him down. He'd have to say, Bones, what if I was wrong? 3 men are dead because of this, you know? And so he was a character who beat himself up all the time. And if there's anybody out there who's into these new movies, it'd be nice to hear from you. You know, maybe there's been some scenes like that. But, Gary, I haven't seen them. You know, what I see characters flying through the air like superheroes.
Yeah.
And making little cute remarks. And I'm going, this isn't Star Trek. This is Star Wars.
Yeah, it's not the same thing.
And Star Wars is fun, but it's fantasy. There's nothing real in it.
Now, R.W. Wells just sent a message. Can you give us a little bit more scoop on the trouble with the Tribbles episode?
A friend just came in and let the dog in, and that's what you hear in the background.
No
Fortunately,
problem.
we're not on the radio shows anymore. The dog is on his way out, so we'll have quiet in a moment.
Oh, that's fine.
Pray for quiet. Okay, we're okay. So I missed what you
okay. R.W. Wells just kind of sent a message. Can you have Mark tell us, give us a scoop on Trouble with the Tribbles episode, a little bit more?
Trouble with Tribbles, and we should get David Gerald on your show one night. David and I have done a couple shows together, and he wrote the Trouble with Tribbles. Interesting episode. During the second season of Star Trek, Gene Coon had come in to produce the show because Roddenberry was burned out. Producing and rewriting every script during most of that first season, he was fried. So he brought in Gene Coon to be the script rewriter, and Gene liked comedy. So Gene was working more and more comedy into Star Trek. Now, it wasn't Lost in Space type comedy. It was natural comedy, organic comedy between the characters, and it worked really well. So halfway into the second season, Gene Coon does The Trouble with Tribbles, which was really Star Trek's first comedy episode. And they did another one called I Mud, and they did another one under Gene Coon's tenure called A Piece of the Action. And Roddenberry came in onto the soundstage, and he had been reading the scripts and giving notes, and Trouble with Tribbles was a lighter type of an episode, but it wasn't really written to be a comedy. And he came onto the soundstage just when that door slid open and all the Tribbles fell out on top of Kirk, and he was buried in a pile of Tribbles. And Roddenberry walks to the soundstage and hears all this laughing going on. And yet the red light's on, which means they're filming. Why is everybody laughing when they're filming? And he walks over there and he sees that scene being shot. And so he brought Gene Coon into his office, and they had a bit of a disagreement, creative differences about the fact that he was letting Star Trek get too funny. And so that's when Gene Coon turned in his resume and left the show. But in his wake, he left behind some really delightful episodes, because I think Star Trek under Gene Coon handled comedy very, very well. And Gene Roddenberry, being a former military man, thought there can be moments of humor on the ship, but it's a military vessel. You know, you're not going to be telling jokes in front of the captain. There's not going to be that much playfulness between these characters, and he wanted to keep it real. And he felt that Gene Coon was taking it a little to the side. So that's why Gene Coon left. Nobody ever knew that until the second volume of this 3-book set, where I covered that, because, as I said, I had access to the memos and I had everybody giving me interviews. But beyond that, Trouble with Tribbles is a very pleasant episode to watch, and it has a message just like all Star Trek messages do. And David Gerald would tell you it's about sometimes the most harmless things in our lives can be the most dangerous things. And in this case, it's these fuzzy little creatures that are reproducing massively, and nothing can stop them from reproducing. But he was also making a statement about overpopulation.
Yeah, and he also showed what happened because what the food they were eating actually killed them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's true. So he's making a message about that, too. Now, that was poisoned by the Klingons and a spy of the Klingons, but it was a very interesting thing to where the more of this food you ate, the less nutrition you were getting. Well, does that ring any bells for any of your listeners right now? I mean, look what the food industry keeps giving us. We have more obese people than we've ever had before. We have more people with diabetes than we've ever had before. When I was a kid, my mom had diabetes, and nobody knew what that even was. Now everybody and their brother and sister knows what diabetes is, because half of them have it. And it's because we're getting all this food that we crave because we get addicted to it because of the stuff they put in there, just like cigarettes, to get us addicted. But we're not getting any nutrition out of this food. So David, he was putting all this stuff in there. He was talking about the food that we eat. He was talking about overpopulation. He was talking about sometimes harmless little things can be the most dangerous to us if we're not careful. And all three of these subjects, all three of these themes, he put into this lighthearted little episode called The Trouble with Triples, and that's typical of all the episodes of Star Trek.
Now, I got to ask you a question. The new making of with Picard, okay, that's going on. What's your feeling of them coming out with what the after of, you know, the next generation, where he's going to be totally kind of different than what he was? The whole idea behind it, as a writer, what do you think? Do you think they can pull it off?
If they have good writers, sure, you can pull off anything. If you have good writers, and it can be terrible if you have bad writers. Really, I shouldn't blame the writers. It's really the producers and the network, the people in charge, because they're the ones who are going to say yay or nay to the story ideas and the scripts. But I've taught screenwriting for quite a few years now, as all of us screenwriters do as we get older, and we get tired of playing with the system and fighting the system. So rather than going out and getting a script assignment, we go into a classroom and teach new people how to write it and share our experiences. And something that really disturbs me is that so few of the students in my classes would understand what theme is, you know? And so that's a vital element to storytelling. And I would read their pages. You know, they would bring in sample pages of the scripts they were working on. And you'd read this stuff, and okay, there's a funny joke, or here's an action moment, but it all was kind of mute. It was all kind of dead. And the reason it was dead is because there was no real characters behind it. There was no message behind it. There was no passion from the writer of anything they were trying to say or accomplish, other than just entertain you for an hour or 2 hours, and then you go off and switch channels and find something else to entertain yourself with. And so I would talk to them. I said, what's the theme of this? And they would look at me and go, huh? Okay, well, there's the problem. And so I'm finding that a lot of the new writers don't understand theme. Because you said this earlier in the show, Gary. You were talking about the new shows don't quite hit you as well as the old ones, and you did what I always did. You got humble and you said, well, maybe it's because I'm an old fart. I don't think either of us are old farts. I think we just recognize good from bad. And fortunately, we're old enough to where we were spoiled and we saw a lot of good. So we're now seeing shows that don't have theme, that don't have a message, that don't have characters who are believable, that don't have fight scenes that are believable, that they're comic book, that don't even have, and nothing looks believable because it's all CGI. And we sit there and we watch that and we go, why am I watching this? Let me go pull out a 20-year-old movie and I'll go watch that, and it'll be real trucks and real people and real horses and real camels and real explosions and real messages and real characters. And okay, it's 20 years old, but it's in color and it looks great. And if it's not in color, it's in black and white and it looks great. I'll go watch that because this new thing is just junk.
Well,
I feel sorry. I feel sorry for the people younger than us. I wouldn't want to be younger than me because we had the best of all of it. And when I see this new stuff, I'm just left cold by a lot of it. There's some good stuff on. I'm getting into Game of Thrones right now and so forth. I'm not going to put Game of Thrones on the same level as Star Trek because I don't really see the message behind a lot of the stories. I see a lot of nudity and a lot of violence, but it's damn entertaining, and it's certainly well done, and it holds my interest. And I certainly loved Breaking Bad and so on, but I wouldn't watch those 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times like I will an old Star Trek.
You couldn't.
So it all has to do with quality.
Well,
so to answer your question, if they get the right producer who can recognize a good story from a bad story and therefore hires good writers, they can pull it off. Of course they can pull it off, but they can really lay an egg if they don't know what they're doing.
Well, I was for Mother's Day, I was at my son's house on Saturday for a barbecue. And, all these young people, and they were talking. I said, hey, can you just put something good on? Something sci-fi, space or whatever. And my son loaded this movie on, and I started watching it. And I started going, you know what? It's so fake. I mean, I'm talking about it's all digitized, half of it. And the plot was so weak. And I watched it for 2 hours, and you know what? The time I got home, if you asked me one part of the movie, I probably couldn't remember. But I can go back and, like, some of the Star Trek movies, certainly the series, and if you start talking about it, it clicks a bell in my mind, and I remember it. and that puts an imprint in your brain.